In the quiet dawn of Fort Ashton, where the air carried the weight of new beginnings, an old man stepped from a rusted pickup, his weathered hands clutching a canvas bag that held more than just a rifle. Edward Eddie Dawson, with his faded flannel and a limp that whispered of battles long past, wasn't here to prove anything, yet his presence stirred something deep in the hearts of those watching. Have you ever met someone whose quiet strength spoke louder than words? This is the story of a man whose single shot would remind a new generation that true skill and the stories behind it never fade. The morning air at Fort Ashton, a modest army base nestled just beyond the town's edge, carried a crisp chill that sharpened the senses. The firing range, usually a quiet stretch of open land, hummed with anticipation. Rows of new recruits stood shoulder to shoulder, their helmets slightly askew, rifles slick with fresh oil, each one eager to prove themselves in the quarterly marksmanship test. The faint scent of gunpowder lingered, mingling with the damp earth underfoot. Off to the side, a weathered Ford pickup crunched to a stop on the gravel path, its engine coughing as it settled. The driver's door creaked open, and out stepped an elderly man, his movements deliberate, as if each step was a negotiation with time. His name was Edward Dawson, though most knew him as Eddie. A faded flannel peeked out from under his worn windbreaker, and his left boot dragged slightly, betraying a limp that spoke of old battles. A simple canvas bag, frayed at the edges, hung from his shoulder. Not military issue, just a relic of a life well lived. Private Jesse Dawson, Eddie's grandson, broke from the line of recruits and jogged over, his face lighting up with a mix of pride and excitement. "Grandpa, you made it," he said softly, his voice barely carrying over the chatter of the range. Eddie's lips curved into a faint smile, the kind that held years of unspoken stories. "Wouldn't miss it, Jesse. Gotta see you boys make your mark." A younger recruit nearby glanced over, his curiosity fleeting. "Who's the old man?" he muttered. Jesse turned, his chest puffing slightly. "My grandfather. He used to shoot, back in the day." The recruit's attention drifted, already lost in the rhythm of the range. The instructors, focused on the recruits, barely registered Eddie's presence at first. Sergeant Kramer, a range instructor with a no-nonsense demeanor, eventually approached, dragging a plastic chair behind him. "You're welcome to watch, sir," he said, his tone polite but clipped, as if Eddie were just a spectator who needed managing. "Might want to stay behind the line, though. It gets loud." Eddie nodded, his expression unreadable. "Appreciate it." But as he moved to sit, he paused, his fingers brushing the clasp of his canvas bag. He reached inside and pulled out a long object wrapped in cloth. Unfolding it carefully, he revealed an aged rifle, its wood polished smooth by years of handling, its metal worn but gleaming faintly. He ran his hand along the barrel, a gesture so tender it was like greeting a long-lost friend. No one paid much attention. Not yet. Sergeant Kramer caught sight of the rifle and let out a short, dismissive chuckle. "Didn't know folks still carried Woodstock rifles like that," he said, his tone light but edged with condescension. "Might belong in a museum, sir." Eddie's eyes crinkled slightly, unbothered. "She still fires long as my hands don't give out." Jesse shifted, his cheeks flushing with unease. "He was pretty good back then," he said, glancing at Kramer, who was already scanning the line of recruits, barely listening. "We've got a spare target at lane 9, Kramer offered, his voice casual, almost patronizing. "If he wants to take a couple shots. You know, for fun." The word fun hung awkwardly, met with no laughter, only the faint rustle of the recruits adjusting their gear. Eddie stepped toward lane 9, his pace slower than the spry recruits around him. He adjusted his glasses, the lenses catching the morning light, and squared his shoulders as best he could. His left knee trembled faintly, a reminder of old injuries. A few recruits nearby exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of amusement and pity. "Bet he can't even keep the barrel steady," one whispered. Another stifled a laugh. "Might need a medic on standby." Eddie didn't react. Either he didn't hear, or he chose not to. He raised the rifle, his movements deliberate, and closed one eye. His chest rose and fell with a deep, steadying breath. Then the sharp crack of the shot rang out. The bullet missed, sailing wide of the target. A brief silence followed, broken by muffled snickers. Kramer clapped his hands briskly. All right, let's not burn through too much ammo. But Eddie's voice cut through, calm and measured. One more. Kramer turned, eyebrows raised, caught off guard by the quiet authority in the old man's tone. Sir, maybe it's best if... Eddie met his gaze, unflinching. One more. It wasn't loud, but something in his voice, a steady, unshakable resolve, made the air feel heavier. Jesse stepped forward, his face bright with confidence. He's got this. Kramer hesitated, glancing at the other instructors, then gave a reluctant nod. All right, one more. Eddie didn't rush. He stood still for a moment, his thumb tracing the worn stock of the rifle, as if it held memories only he could see. He adjusted his grip, slow and precise, his hand steady now, no trace of the earlier tremor. The wind died down and the chatter of the recruits faded into the background. Eddie's world narrowed to the rhythm of his breath, inhale, exhale, focus. He raised the rifle again, his posture calm, almost serene. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. Then bang! The shot tore through the silence, its echo rolling across the range like a low, resonant note. No one spoke. The recruits' murmurs stopped, and even the instructors froze. Someone in the back muttered, "Was that a hit?" Kramer leaned into the spotting scope, his jaw tightening as he adjusted the focus, zooming in as far as it would go. He pulled back, his face pale, and said nothing. Jesse, his nerves fraying, looked up. "Sarge?" Kramer didn't respond. He gestured for another instructor to take a look. One thought the instructors passed the scope, their expressions shifting from skepticism to something else, something like awe. The recruits, sensing the change, grew quiet. A young soldier stepped forward, raising his binoculars. "No way," he breathed. At the far end of the range, the laminated silhouette target fluttered lightly in the breeze. The bullseye was torn clean through, a perfect hole sliced edge to edge, as if carved by a blade. One shot, dead center, flawless. Eddie lowered his rifle, his movements unhurried like he'd just finished a routine task. His face held no trace of pride or smugness, only a quiet satisfaction. He turned to Jesse and said simply, "That'll do." The recruit with the binoculars shook his head, stunned. He didn't even brace. Another muttered, "I didn't think he could lift that thing properly." Jesse's grin widened, his chest swelling with pride. He doesn't need to brace. He perfected that stance in '68. A recruit nearby leaned in, his voice low. "Wait, what's his name again?" Kramer cleared his throat, his tone softer now. "Edward Dawson." The name settled over the range like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through the crowd. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent. A voice from the back called out, "You don't think that's the Eddie Dawson from Fort Bragg, do you?" Kramer didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said he already knew. A soldier broke away from the group, jogging toward the main office without a word. Moments later, dusty personnel logs were being pulled from an outdated computer system, names and dates flashing across the screen as someone searched for Eddie. He had already returned to his chair, carefully tucking the rifle back into its canvas sleeve. Not to hide it, but to let it rest. He glanced at Jesse and gave a small nod, the kind that carried the weight of a promise kept. Not for himself, but for his grandson to witness. The recruits stood frozen, their eyes darting between Eddie and the torn bullseye, as if it held a truth bigger than the shot itself. And in that moment, it did. The name Edward Dawson spread quietly through the crowd. Some recruits shrugged, unfamiliar with its significance. But Master Sergeant Clayton, an older officer with graying temples and a career winding toward retirement, stopped mid-step. His eyes narrowed, recognition dawning. "Dawson. Fort Bragg, '83, right?" he asked, his voice low. Kramer nodded. "Said he shot there." Clayton's gaze lingered on Eddie, a flicker of respect crossing his weathered face. The range felt different now, the air charged with the weight of his legacy no one had expected to encounter that morning. The air at Fort Bragg hung heavy with the scent of gunpowder and pine as Edward Eddie Dawson, an old man with a weathered face and steady hands, walked purposefully toward the range's control building. Inside, the cramped office was a time capsule of faded glory. Shelves sagged under the weight of dusty binders, Tarnished plaques lined the walls, and a computer from the early 2000s hummed reluctantly to life. Eddie's fingers, gnarled but deliberate, tapped out his name on the keyboard. Dawson, Edward. The screen flickered, then delivered its verdict. A scanned photograph of a younger Eddie, lean and bronzed by the sun, standing beside a paper target sliced cleanly through its heart. The record beneath it read, Fort Bragg Marksmanship Record, 1983. Longest standing bullseye shot in open-range conditions. Unbroken. The timestamp marked July 12, 1983. 40 years ago, almost to the day. Master Sergeant Clayton, who had followed Eddie inside, stared at the screen, then at the printout in his hand, its weight seeming to anchor him to the moment. He stepped back into the sunlight, clutching the paper like it carried the gravity of history. By the time Clayton returned to the range, a black SUV with government plates and a small flag decal had rolled into the gravel lot. Colonel Daniel Whitmore, the base commander, emerged, his face unreadable. He strode across the field, boots crunching on the earth, until he stood before Eddie, who sat quietly on a bench, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Eddie didn't rise, he just tilted his head upward, meeting Whitmore's gaze. The colonel removed his hat, holding it to his chest. "Sir," he said, his voice low and reverent, "we've got a plaque inside the range office. Your name's been on it for 40 years. Some of us read it every year, but most never knew the man behind it was still out here, still walking among us." Eddie gave a faint nod, his expression soft but guarded. "Didn't come here for a pat on the back," he murmured. Whitmore's eyes didn't waver. "That shot you made today, it wasn't chance. It was legacy." Around them, the atmosphere shifted. The recruits, who had been slouching or whispering among themselves, now stood taller, their chatter silenced. The instructors, including Sergeant Kramer, who had earlier dismissed Eddie as a frail observer, stepped back, their faces a mix of awe and contrition. Private Jesse Dawson, Eddie's grandson, stood nearby, his chest swelling with a new kind of pride, not just the admiration of a young soldier for his grandfather, but the dawning realization that his family name carried a weight he'd never fully grasped. Eddie rested a hand on Jesse's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "I trained a lot of soldiers in my time," he said quietly. "Figured it was about time I came to see one in action." As the sun dipped behind the trees that afternoon, word of Eddie's shot rippled through the base. In the lounge, young soldiers gathered, their voices hushed as they recounted the story of the retired sharpshooter who had returned and, against all odds, still hadn't missed. Inside the control office, Jesse sat beside his grandfather, cradling the old rifle across his knees. "You never told me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eddie gazed out the window, his eyes tracing the fading light. "Wasn't much worth telling," he replied, his tone soft but final. Jesse shook his head, unconvinced. "You've held a base record for 40 years. Trained half the snipers who came through here. They say you were one of the best Fort Bragg ever saw." Eddie shrugged, the motion small and unassuming. "Records gather dust, medals get tucked away. What matters is showing up for the people who need you, even when no one's watching." Jesse reached into Eddie's worn canvas bag, pushing aside a cleaning cloth and a pair of ancient earplugs. His fingers found a leather folder, its edges frayed from years of quiet existence. Inside were newspaper clippings, a faded certificate, and a photograph. The image showed a young Eddie kneeling beside two soldiers, one a young lieutenant named Parker, the other a man in a wheelchair, his face lit with a half salute and a weary smile. The headline above them read, "Army Sharpshooter Saves 3 in Ambush, Declines Medal." Jesse's voice was soft but insistent. "I found this online a few years back. Didn't know it was you." Eddie leaned forward, his thumb brushing the photograph's edge, his eyes distant. "Those boys didn't make it home," he said after a long pause. "Parker lived long enough to tell the story, and that's the only reason anyone wrote it down." Jesse studied his grandfather's face, searching for more. "Why'd you stop shooting?" he asked. Eddie sat still, the silence stretching between them. "After that day," he finally said, "it didn't feel like a skill anymore. It felt like a weight. So I taught others, stayed behind the line, let the younger ones carry it forward." Jesse didn't reply, but his nod spoke volumes, a quiet acknowledgement that said, "I hear you. I see you. I'll carry this too." Outside, a handful of recruits had gathered near the office door. They weren't there for drills or orders. They lined up to shake Eddie's hand. One by one they approached, their gestures simple, their words brief. "Thank you, sir." No one pressed for tales of night missions or unclaimed medals. Eddie met each handshake with a nod, his quiet grace conveying a truth he had long accepted. He hadn't come to be remembered, but to ensure he wasn't forgotten. The next morning the range was still, no drills or barked commands disturbing the peace. Only the wind whispered through the pines. Eddie arrived early, carrying nothing but a thermos of coffee and his cap tucked under his arm. At the far end of the range, Jesse waited with 4 recruits, the same ones who had snickered 2 days earlier, now clutching fresh targets and wearing expressions of nervous determination. They weren't afraid of a reprimand, they were afraid of letting him down. "Private Dawson," Eddie called, his voice steady but warm. "These boys any good?" Jesse grinned. "Better than they were. Still got a ways to go." Eddie nodded approvingly. "Good. Keep 'em steady." He stayed back that morning, never touching a rifle or offering grand advice. But every so often, Jesse glanced over, seeking the reassurance of his grandfather's presence. And Eddie was always there, watching. As the recruits packed up, Sergeant Kramer approached, his posture less rigid than before. "I owe you an apology, sir," he said quietly. "I thought you were just some old guy tagging along. Had no idea I was standing in front of the man who wrote half our training manuals." Eddie shook his hand, his grip firm but forgiving. "We all start somewhere, Sergeant. It's how we finish that counts." Kramer managed a small smile. "That shot you made, it's framed now. The target's going up in the main office, right next to your 1983 plaque." Eddie raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "Still got that old thing hanging around?" Kramer nodded. "We do now." Before Eddie left, Jesse caught up to him, his voice tinged with urgency. "They're going to talk about you now, Grandpa. The others, you'll be remembered." Eddie took a slow sip from his thermos, his eyes sweeping the quiet range. "I'm not worried about being remembered," he said softly. "I'm just glad someone else knows the story now." He pulled his cap over his head and walked to his truck, his steps unhurried. Jesse lingered a moment longer, watching him go, the weight of his grandfather's legacy settling into his bones. Sometimes a legacy doesn't need monuments or speeches, just one perfect shot and someone to witness it. 3 days later, a new frame appeared on the wall of the range's main office, hung beside the dusty 1983 plaque. Inside was the target from Eddie's recent shot. Still split, still flawless. A small brass plate beneath it read, "Edward Dawson, Fort Bragg, 1983. Returned 2023. Still precise, still humble." Most who passed by didn't notice it at first, but those who knew stopped, their eyes lingering on the name. In the corner of the office, a retired Marine leaned close to a colleague and whispered, "He missed once." Then he smiled as if the imperfection only deepened the legend. Under the sprawling shade of an ancient oak, its leaves whispering secrets to the soft afternoon breeze. Edward Eddie Dawson sat alone on a weathered bench beside the flagpole at the edge of the training field. The flag above him fluttered gently, its colors faded but proud, much like the man himself. His cane, a reluctant companion these days, leaned untouched against the bench, its polished wood gleaming faintly in the dappled sunlight. In his gnarled hands, Eddie cradled a simple paper napkin, folded with the precision of a man who'd spent a lifetime perfecting his aim, and a steaming cup of black coffee, its bitter aroma curling into the air like a memory. Jesse Dawson, his grandson, approached with the tentative steps of youth tempered by awe. Private Jesse, still fresh in his crisp recruit uniform, carried the weight of his grandfather's legend in his chest, a mixture of pride and quiet longing to live up to it. He'd heard the stories, whispered tales of Eddie's days as a sharpshooter, the man who could thread a bullet through the eye of a storm and make it look effortless. Today, though, Jesse had seen it for himself. The way the range had fallen silent when Eddie, unassuming and stooped with age, had taken the rifle in his hands. The way Sergeant Kramer, all bluster and skepticism at first, had straightened up, his barked orders softening to a murmur of respect. The way Master Sergeant Clayton's eyes had gleamed with recognition, his gruff voice recounting a tale from decades past. Eddie saving Lieutenant Parker's life with a single, impossible shot. Even the young recruits, cocky and eager to prove themselves, had stood slack-jawed, their doubts dissolving into the dust kicked up by Eddie's perfect mark. "You come to fire again, Grandpa?" Jesse asked, settling onto the bench beside him, his voice carrying the eager curiosity of a boy who'd just glimpsed a myth come to life. Eddie's lips twitched, a faint smile creasing the lines of his weathered face. "Fire," he echoed, his voice low, like gravel smoothed by years of quiet reflection. He shook his head, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the sharp crack of rifles echoed from the range. "No, son, I just came to listen." Jesse tilted his head, confused. "Listen to what?" Eddie nodded toward the field, where a new batch of recruits was lining up, their rifles glinting under the sun. The rhythmic pop of gunfire carried on the wind, a symphony of discipline and focus that needed no conductor. "That," he said simply, his eyes distant but sharp, as if he could still see every target he'd ever hit, every moment he'd ever owned. The sound of it, the purpose in it. They sat there side by side, the old man and the young soldier, wrapped in a silence that spoke louder than words. The breeze stirred the leaves again, and the flag above them snapped softly, a reminder of the years Eddie had carried its weight in his heart. There was no need to recount the stories, the shot that saved Parker, the missions that had carved Eddie's name into the quiet corners of history. Some legacies don't need to be shouted. They live in the steady grip of a rifle, the unflinching gaze of a man who knows his worth, and the respect that lingers in the air long after the bullet finds its mark. Even now, 20 years after his last shot, Eddie's precision hadn't faded. It had simply settled into the lines of his hands, the tilt of his head, the quiet strength that needed no audience. Jesse watched his grandfather, feeling the weight of that silence, the kind that didn't demand explanation, but carried a story all its own. He thought of the recruits back at the range, their faces still lit with the afterglow of what they'd witnessed, a man who'd reminded them that discipline wasn't just in the pull of a trigger, but in the life lived behind it. Colonel Whitmore had said it best, his voice steady as he'd shaken Eddie's hand. "You showed him what it means to never miss." And Eddie, at Bowie, ever the quiet giant, had only nodded, letting the moment speak for itself.